Yeah, so this was the session title, and there are my contact details if anybody wants me. I throw a lot of code on GitHub, and I also have a team page on the Spring.io website. And at the bottom is, in case the camera isn't on, because that exactly is a picture of me, obviously, is my little avatar that Tasha set up for this session, which is extremely amusing. As you can tell, I was probably wearing the same hoodie on the day that that cartoon was drawn as I am now today. This was the blurb that we put out on the schedule. So, some ideas for what you might want to talk about.
Yeah, and we
anything
do.
you're struggling with, anything that you want to ask about. I mean, I don't, I don't have any special projects at the minute, but I have contributed to quite a lot of Spring Boot and Spring Cloud, if those are the things you're using. I'm following very closely what's happening with Spring Boot 2.3 and all the Kubernetes work. I've been doing a lot of Kubernetes research recently, so I could talk about that, although there are other sessions in Spring Live on that, so you will hear, I think you will have heard yesterday if you were there, from Cora and maybe somebody else. There's something later on today, I'm sure, in the EMEA segment. I think it's Alberto's doing a Kubernetes presentation, so that'll be worth seeing. But I could talk about what I've been thinking about.
Well, we do
Mainly,
have some questions that have started to come in, Dave. Do you want me to try?
we?
Yeah, do you want me to pass them your way, and you could?
So people would probably, yeah, go on then. Is it in the Q&A? I can see the Q&A.
Yeah, so I'll read them out to you. Okay, so so the first one's from Deshaun Carter, and he says he's a big fan of Spring Boot 2.3 improvements. I think possibly he's talking about the milestones, especially build image based on Ubuntu Bionic base. But he couldn't get it working with his Raspberry Pi on ARM.
Oh, that's sad, isn't it? Yeah, I don't know if there is a pivotal VMware official ARM image for the builders, but I don't think it's all that difficult to create one. I think, that might be something that you could raise with the build pack team themselves, right? I mean, so there's it's sometimes a little bit hard to find. Let me see if I can just find it noodling around on here. So on github.com, you will find probably an organization called Build Packs. There we go. So somewhere in there, like Pack, for instance, that would be a good place to raise an issue about this. That's the CLI that drives the same process as the Spring Boot thing does. So Spring Boot hasn't invented build packs, right? Spring Boot is just kind of driving them from a Maven Gradle plugin, but it would be not difficult, I'm not saying trivial, but not difficult to change the build pack that Spring Boot triggers when you type Spring Boot build image. If people, I guess I could just do a quick demo if people are wondering what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. And if I recall, I think maybe Cora also did some talking
Cora
about.
probably showed it yesterday, yeah. So it'll show up online eventually. But I have here just a Spring Boot application that I just downloaded from start.spring.io, and so I could build it with Maven. I also have a Docker file there, but I don't need it. If I'm going to do Maven Spring Boot build image, this is the thing that Deshaun was talking about. So when I do that, let me just expand this. It does the normal Maven build, which is what's happening right now. So it's making sure that all your tests pass, basically. And then it goes off, and here you can see it has downloaded an image to do a build of another image. And so that's the key, right? It's all encapsulated in Docker images, which you can put anywhere. So this one is docker.io. It's on Docker Hub, Cloud Foundry, CNB, and there's a Bionic label which tells me that it's Ubuntu, and therefore it's at least possible that it might work on ARM and Raspberry Pi. There we go. So we've now finished, and we've got Docker. We've got an image inspect. Oops, the image that I built was, I'm building it on my local registry. So there's a load of stuff there to do with how the container was created, right? Normal Docker stuff. And then at the bottom there, you've got also more additional metadata that the build pack added. So this is probably more detailed than Cora showed. So this is, yeah, this is a really good way to build reliable, reproducible images where somebody else has to make all the decisions about which JDK to use, which base image to use, which distro. You know, I didn't really care, right? I just type Spring Boot build and it works. And so to customize that and to make it point to a different builder, a different build image, you would, I don't know if these options even exist yet, right? But they do for Pack, so they definitely could for Spring Boot. There's some configuration options here in the Maven plugin. And so I was using it just to change the image name, but you could use it to do other things. There we go. So yeah, look up the documentation and there might be a way to change the build pack. Maybe that's it, I don't know. But because it's a build pack, it's completely modular, and therefore you could, in principle, change it to use a different base image, different build packs within the builder. You can, so the process that we just saw working there, let me show you that, how that worked. There was a bunch of stuff happened there, and here we go. So we've got these build packs are going to, 13 build packs had a look at my app to try and decide which of them was going to help. And 6 of them responded that they would be able to contribute something. So one of them sent me an OpenJDK, one of them sent me how to run a JVM application like Java -jar or something like that. One of them had a look in and said it was going to maybe contribute a Tomcat platform, which I didn't need, in fact, in the end. One of them is the Spring Boot build pack, which knows about the Spring Boot fat jars. One of them is one that knows about a zipped format, so not fat jars, but a zipped application. So that one wasn't used in the end either. And one of them is, if you've ever used Cloud Foundry with Spring Apps, you'll be familiar with this auto reconfiguration thing. So this means that the image that I built will run in the same way on Cloud Foundry that an app would run if I did CF push. So that's kind of a nice continuity feature, I guess. There probably will be more changes there before we get to sort of 1.0 of this stuff, but so this is lifecycle 0.6. So that, yeah, that's all really great. What exactly was the question again? It was just somebody who liked it.
Yeah, it was someone who's tried this and likes it very much.
Oh, but couldn't do the Raspberry Pi. That's right. Yeah,
yes, whether there will be sort of an.
It's definitely possible, because it's all about the image that you're using to do the builds, and you can create those images and put them on Docker Hub yourself. So if you made one with a base image that was ARM compatible, then that would probably work with all the existing build packs, I think. And the way to learn how to do that is to go to this place. This actually probably Lifecycle is probably the repo that you're interested in. But this cloud native build packs and buildpacks.io is the sort of knowledge base for builders and build packs, and that's what the Spring Boot feature is driving.
Cool.
How are we doing for questions? Are we going to move on?
Yeah, good. Else? Yeah. So
I think you should ask this question about the X-wing. Everybody wants to know what that ship is on the back of your.
We'll get to that later, maybe if there's time. So the next one that I have on my list, Dave, is an interesting one. Are there any plans to introduce anything that gives us a sort of ahead of time compile-like features in Spring Boot?
Yeah.
Is there
Let me
anything you
find
can
some
talk
links.
about there? Is it work that's ongoing?
Yeah, let me
I
find
guess
some
folks are
links.
interested in things like lower memory consumption, maybe, or maybe smaller image sizes, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, so ahead of time compilation gets you to, mm, well, there's one or two, there's different options, but the one that everybody's sort of most excited about, and the one that was mentioned there was Graal VM, right? So there is this thing here. So there's an experimental project. It's work in progress. There was sort of a commitment from Jürgen about Spring 5.3 that it would, at the core, have the ability at least to support, we would define exactly what we meant with it about it as we get towards the release date, but there will be enough support in Spring Boot 5.3, Spring 5.3, Spring Boot, that means 2.4 probably, to, I think, reliably run at least a subclass of Spring Boot applications. So this stuff is all experimental, right? It's all, even on the Oracle side, it's experimental. They're still working on it. They still have performance issues. They still have, support issues. There's quite a lot of features in Java applications in third-party libraries, not necessarily in Spring, right, that just don't work. And they're still papering over a lot of those cracks. So to help them with that, we set this project up, and it has a couple of features. One of them is, well, there are some samples, so you can try out all these samples. You can see the range of things that might work. So you've got Spring Cloud Function, for instance. You've got some ORM with Hibernate. You've got JPA with Spring Data JPA, that is. You've got Timeleaf, Tomcat, Netty, Pet Clinic even is there. So there's some samples, so you can see the sort of range of things that are possible and what you have to do to achieve them. And in most cases, what you have to do to achieve them, let me just pick a random sample. Here's a Spring Boot Tomcat application. It is basically just a Spring Boot application, but it has oh, it didn't even add it to the dependencies. Okay, so there's a build script here that adds an additional dependency. I'm sorry, I was expecting to see it in the Maven dependencies, but it's not there. So what you do is you build your app and then you run it with this native feature here, which is a library, and that's it builds on a set of features that the Oracle team provided for AOT. And so if you include that on your class path when you build a native image, then it adds a lot of knowledge, a lot of opinions that kind of pull together everything we know about how Spring and Spring Boot work in a native image, and basically mean you don't have to write all those ugly JSON files, so that we can sort of, do dynamic computations in code using the Oracle provided APIs, basically SDKs at runtime. So all this stuff is, it's available. We haven't had a GA release of it, but neither again has Oracle had a GA release of the Grail native tooling underneath it. So we'll get there. We'll get there together. We're sort of working with the Oracle team, fixing bugs as we come across them, and we're extending the range of the functions little by little. We're tidying up this feature so that it's easier to use, easier to extend, so that you could write your own opinions, for instance, those kinds of things. So it's work in progress. I would encourage you to try it out.
Can we, just for folks who perhaps haven't really heard about some of this stuff, because there will be plenty of folks who would be in that bracket. So GraalVM, for example, is a way to basically ahead of time take your code and turn it into something that runs much more natively than on top of a regular Java virtual machine, right?
Yes. So you're building a binary executable which is platform specific, therefore. So it's not, like a JVM. Not like a Java code. It's not portable.
Is it more like
But
an
it does.
operating system and
It's
a
more like what you get when you compile a Go application, for instance.
right?
If you do, Go build, then you get a binary, and you can just take that binary and run it on another Linux system. There might be some, linkage issues, some shared libraries, those kinds of things. So there are options to take into account. I guess you can do statically linked or dynamically linked, and then it might break when you move it. Those kinds of questions. It's a different way of running Java applications. At this point, when you've got that native image and you're running it, you're not really running Java anymore. You're just running, a binary executable that you generated using some code that you wrote in Java. So that could be quite a different experience than running a Java application in a JVM. So some of the JVM features that you're used to, for instance, the observability features, debugging, those kinds of things, you just don't have access to them anymore. But on the other hand, the reason everybody's excited about it, there is a good chance that your application will start up quickly, and because it doesn't have to load a lot of classes, basically all of that stuff is done pre-computed, and there's a good chance that it might also run in a smaller memory footprint. So it's it doesn't have the same memory structure that a JVM does. It doesn't have big caches. That's what the way the JVM works, right? When it starts up, it grabs a lot of memory and says, okay, I might need that later, so I'll just grab it and hold on to it. And so you've got, reserve code cache, metaspace, heap, thread pools, stack space, all sorts of memory reservations that the JVM makes, and it might or might not actually need them in order to carry out the business functions that you need it to. So there's a possibility, at least, that you can reduce the memory footprint of a Java application significantly by using a native image. I think that's the promise that everybody's looking for.
Yeah, and these are valid use cases, aren't they? There are folks who will be very interested in that, but there are also challenges in getting there, right? So there are issues with your Java code, things like reflection, for example, that might make it difficult to just go, okay, yeah, I'll just turn it straight into an image. Then there's a lot of detailed work.
Yeah, reflection specifically isn't actually that much of a problem, except the more reflection you use, the bigger the images are. So if you're hoping to get like a 20 megabyte executable binary, then if you're using any reflection, that's not going to help. That's not going to help the problem.
So
But
what
reflection is
are
well supported. There are lots of native APIs inside the JDK, right? Everywhere where the Java, where the virtual machine calls out to native code is kind of a problem. So, for instance, I mean, like just last week or the week before, we discovered that in native images currently with GraalVM, they don't support time zones, and they don't support resource bundles for, how Spring does internationalization, where you convert a message key into a message. They don't do internationalization because they don't do locales and they don't do time zones. And that's basically just a part of the JDK feature set that they haven't covered yet in native images. So they'll probably get there, but it's every time you turn around, there's another one of those kind of ugly little corners of the JVM, because it's that's a big code base that's been sitting there for decades, right? And it'll take them some time to sort of swing around and cover every single corner case. There's quite a few that will just therefore break at the minute, or they'll give you confusing results, like with the time zones, for instance. You could, if you compile a native image in London, GMT, and then run it in India, it'll get all the times wrong because it'll think that it's still in London. So that's the kind of problems that you're going to run into if you kind of just walk into this blindly without really evaluating all of the all of the nitty gritty ins and outs of it. I do think it's a pretty good story for a fairly large class of Spring applications. They'll work pretty well. Like for instance, this function example here. So I'll do another function sample, I think, soon, because I want one that will run on Amazon on Lambda. This one is a sort of standalone function, but simple apps like that where there isn't much going on and all you really want is to write just the simple business logic in something like a function. There's a good chance that you'll be quite happy with all of the compromises, and all you want is everything else to happen as quickly as possible so that you can get straight into your business logic. And I think that probably is quite a good use case.
So the takeaway message there seems to be it's a maturing picture. It's work that's ongoing. It's progressing all the time, but there are still some maturity required generally in that particular part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I mean, I don't want to sound negative about it. I think it's all
no, not at all. I think that's good. I think it shows
we're all working hard.
Yeah.
We're all thinking hard about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
working together.
Your mention of functions leads me into quite a nice segue. Nicely done, Dave. On to the next question, which is from Sebastian. And Sebastian is interested in starting a project with Kotlin. He wants to deploy it to AWS Lambda. And his question is, how can Spring help me? Is Spring Cloud Function optimized for serverless, etc.? So, any thoughts on that particular question there around Kotlin, AWS, Spring?
Yeah, I don't use Kotlin myself, but there is Kotlin support in Spring and also in Spring Cloud Function, if that was the project you were interested in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could go your own way. You could write code in Java or Kotlin that didn't use Spring, and you'd probably have quite a happy experience there anyway. The reason you might use Spring for this kind of use case is because you know Spring and want to, use that programming model for, comfort, or for, because you're familiar with it. And I guess also if you were thinking that maybe one day you would stop using AWS and use something else, you might want to, run it locally, for instance. I mean, that the example I just showed you is a function that just runs on my laptop. And there was actually a really good article I saw this week on Beldung's site. I wonder if I can find that quickly. It popped up on my Twitter web feed anyway. The beldung.com blog site, right? Yeah. So there was an article. It was a syndicated one, but there was an article last week where somebody wrote a Spring Cloud function and then deployed it on Amazon. So he showed all the steps that you needed to do. He did it in Java, but I think Kotlin would be a good experience doing that as well, because we do have. I know there is some Kotlin support in Spring Cloud Function. So it must be there for a reason. And yeah, because functions are small, they tend to start up pretty quickly. And Amazon has this thing called a custom runtime, where they don't even need to start. So the sort of traditional serverless model is, it's a little web server basically. So you have a function and you wrap it in a web server so that it can accept HTTP requests and pass them down to the function. So they kind of invert that in the Amazon custom runtime, and they make they have a little server running, but what the application code does, it inverts the pattern, and the application code is an HTTP client, and so it can call. It's like the Amazon metadata instance metadata on EC2, right? There's a tiny little web server running on localhost, and so you make a call to localhost to interact with the data that is being sent to you by Lambda. Anyway, we have support for that in Spring Cloud Function. I think that's a little bit faster because it's more lightweight. You only have to start an HTTP client. You don't have to do any binding of ports or anything like that. You just have to basically start a JVM, load a few classes. So it's a little bit faster. I wrote a blog probably more than a year ago now, when Spring Cloud Function 2 came out, because we made some changes here. So there were some advantages, I think, in going from Spring Cloud Function 1 to 2 and using Lambda, and it included this custom runtime thing. So I think the custom runtime was like a 25–30% effect or something like that. So you could sort of have slightly smaller and slightly faster functions, which means they're cheaper. So in terms of the price, it was, I think, 30% cheaper to run than the I guess the standard Java runtime. So not the custom runtime, but the Java runtime that Lambda provides out of the box, which we already supported in Spring Cloud Function. There are also these functional bean things that you can use to, I guess, reduce a little bit of startup time overhead. So I also showed in that blog that has an effect. I think that's a bigger effect going from in an old Spring Boot application. I think new Spring Boot applications, I think with 2.2, I'm not sure it even makes that much difference. I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, but let me just bring my screen back up. There is, yeah, this one, share screen. This isn't a function, but if I was writing a function using Spring Boot, this feature is a Spring Boot 2.2 feature. So if you know that you don't make any calls between @bean methods inside a configuration class, you can mark it as proxy bean methods equals false. So that's it's a good default for, you know, application usage. All of the Spring Boot configuration classes have that flag set, but you do have to set it, and that basically cuts down. It means you don't get any CGI lib usage, so you get a reduced use of proxies and reflection at runtime, so that speeds up the Lambda starting up a bit. So you know, I mean, try it out, see what you think, but let me see if I can find that blog, because there was a nice graph on it.
And while you do that, Dave, maybe it's worth mentioning the new Spring website for anyone who's not seen it. That's where we keep our blog.
Oh yeah, isn't it nice? Look, here it is. Let's see if I can find a blog. This is the sometimes the hardest thing to do, isn't it?
Yes, it
sometimes
is.
The easiest way to find a blog is to know who wrote it.
That's right. I use the community page. I use the team page quite often. But yeah, team Dave Syer, and then all your blogs will be there, won't they, Dave? So this is how you find all of
There
Dave's
we go. That's the graph I was thinking of. So Spring Cloud Function 1.x is the blue graph, and this is the billing. The number, it's megabyte seconds or something, so it's not actually dollars, but it's the billing is proportional to the height of these columns. And so between 1.x and 2.x, just using, you know, things like that feature I just showed you, the proxy bean methods equals false, you get a reduction in billing by like a factor of 4.
Wow.
For small apps, and a bit less than 4 for larger apps. And then the other thing is it's much more constant. So the red lines are almost the same. It doesn't matter how much. This is the memory, by the way, on the x-axis. So half a gig up to 3 gigs of memory. So it used to be that you kind of had to give it a bit more memory to make it go fast enough to be worth it, but it's not so much the case anymore. So you should be able to get functions that, you know, have cold starts and, I don't know, 100 milliseconds or less, and, you know, it's a few hundred milliseconds, I'm sorry, or less. And then, you know, Amazon keeps them warm, right? So as long as you've got some traffic, then you don't pay that cost for every request. It's only the ones that need to do a cold start.
All right. Well, Sebastian, I hope that's answered your question. And also, I hope everyone knows where to find Dave's page now as well on spring.io, so you can have a look at all of his blog posts. I want to remind everyone as well, these are live questions. So put your questions into the Q&A, and if there's time, we'll try and get round to as many as we can. And possibly Dave will stick around a little bit after to answer any that we didn't get to. Dave, I'm going to move on, if that's okay, to the next one. Can I do that?
Yeah, please.
All right, so here we have an anonymous question. It's okay, there's no need to be anonymous if you don't, all friends here. But here we go. So this is kind of a beginner question, and we do get this a lot. So Spring consists of so many parts that connect so many different technologies together. I mean, it's a big ecosystem. We know that. But it's pretty hard for people when they first get started and they look at the Spring initializer to even get a grasp of all of that. So where or how do you start when you want to do microservice architecture, 12 factors, hexagonal, deploy it to the cloud? When you're working with clients, Dave, give us the benefit of your experience. How do you school them in how to get started, to break it all down so it's not quite so much like eating an elephant?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that it is difficult because, yeah, the spring is in some sense its own worst enemy, right? Because it does everything, so you don't know where to start sometimes. I mean,
So I used to tell folks to do maybe Spring Boot and Actuator as a first hour
yeah,
to
that's
get.
what I was gonna say. Just start with the minimal subset. Like, don't put anything in unless you're sure you need it, is the first place to start. And then obviously, we have a really nice set of focused getting started guides on the spring.io. I think that, is there a link there from the initializer these days? There was always talk about doing that, but since the question explicitly mentioned the initializer, let me just pull that up.
Well, I'm thinking off the top of my head, for example, if you start an initializer project and you select
Yeah,
maybe,
look, it's there.
web
You
or
see?
something, right? Gotcha.
Yeah, so I
But
was thinking,
you also get a help text now as well, don't you? So
you do,
there's a little help
yeah,
text.
yeah. Should we see what happens when you do that? So let
Yeah,
me
why not?
do Java, Maven, 2.2 is fine. Yeah, so we'll do Webflux and actuators. We'll do what you said, and then we'll see what's in there.
And the
And there's a
reason we're
help.
sort of saying start here is because basically, like you said, you're not trying to grab all the parts at once. You're starting small, and then you can expand out, right? You can land and expand.
Yeah, yeah. So you've got links in this help.md. You've got links, and you don't have to even download the file to find the links, right? You can just browse around in here. It's really
Yeah.
useful. So then, yeah, let's try adding, I don't know, let's say Kafka. Spring for Apache Kafka. Do I get any new links? Yes, there we go, cool.
So even right from the get-go, from creating your first project, there are some clues in the help text as to where to go next, which tutorials might be useful, which guides you might like in order to get started.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to not to go too crazy with upfront design, right? You have to feel your way. Only, like we just said, use the features that you need. Don't try and throw everything in the bucket. The same thing goes for architecture. If you don't need to build 100 microservices, don't. Right? You could start with one and see if it needs to connect to anything else, and if it does, do that. Move incrementally. Incremental is much better than monolithic for everything, basically.
Yeah,
So
and
that
even
would be my advice.
and even starting here with something small, you already are starting to look more microservice-like because you can benefit from things like jar-based packaging, can't you? So your executables, all they need is a JVM, and you can run it, and it'll have whatever it needs built in. So it'll have Tomcat, or it'll have Netty, or something. You'll be able to
Yeah,
get something from it right
yeah,
from
that's
second.
that's sort of a comfort message, right? It's like if you're using Spring Boot and maybe a tiny bit of Spring Cloud, then there's a high probability that you've already got a 12-factor app, 12-factor app, for instance. You don't have to think too hard about it. It's kind of it's comforting. I think that's that was Josh and Kenny's book basically in a nutshell, wasn't it? As um, whatever they called that, cloud native Spring or cloud native Java with Spring or something like that.
Yeah, and they
It's a book this thick, but actually at the end of the day, all they could have said, well, just use Spring Boot and Spring Cloud, and you're halfway there. So yeah, I mean, we do try to get it right, and we try to make it as easy as possible, but it can be confusing. Try to use the smallest subset that you can, and not go too crazy.
Yeah, and when I was in the field working with clients who were just getting started with this stuff, one place where we might go next. So if you assume that you've got an actuator, for those who didn't see the presentation yesterday on some of that, an actuator allows you to start to look inside your application and see what's happening in there, where it's being configured from, is it alive, what do the logs look like and the traces and all that sort of stuff. So it's a kind of an observability hook into your application. So if you start there, you've already made a good start. You've got a jar that you can execute, and you can observe what's going on inside that thing while it executes. And then you can start to think more about some of the other 12 factor patterns, can't you? Things like externalizing your config, which we would usually use something like Spring Cloud Config to do. Do you use that as well, Dave? Do you use that all the time?
Yeah, that's actually one of the kind of most popular Spring Cloud features, I guess, one that lots of people reach for. I think it's probably I don't know, sometimes overused, I would say as well, because everybody sort of like that the anti-pattern that we just talked about. Everybody wants to use everything, so they just sort of throw everything in and
Yeah.
without really thinking about it sometimes. Spring Cloud Config is a really good tool. It's great for instance, feature flags, right? If you want to have some central control over the behavior of all the apps that are running in your production environment, that's a great option for doing it. Some people prefer different backends for it. So there are, it started with just Git as a backend, but it quite quickly got JDBC, Mongo, Vault, other backends, so that people have basically their own workflows for managing and governing and changing the configuration, but it's all the same as far as the application is concerned. That it's all just configuration data. So it's great for things that change at runtime. Spring config server, so feature flags would be an example of those.
Yeah, and for
So,
folks who are just getting started, basically this is taking stuff that would normally be in something like an application.properties or your application YAML, and it's taking some of those things and externalizing them onto the cloud, so that when you have many, many instances running in many different types of environment, dev, test, prod, you can have different settings applied to each of those.
yeah, actually, that's a good point. That's the other really good use case for Spring Cloud Config Server is the environment-specific things that you don't want to bake into your jar file because you don't know what they are when you build it. Yeah, so that's the other good thing to do.
Yeah, exactly, because it gives you that flexibility. You can have many, many instances running. You can have them
Yeah,
running in different types of environments with different settings applied, and you're not
yeah,
recompiling your code every time you want to do that. It's pulled live from the config server, right?
yeah. I can see another question which is relevant as well in the Q&A. It says, how do you handle your local dev environment using Spring where the cloud services are or might not be available? So Yeah, good question. And specifically about the config server, you can get into a real mess actually if your app needs to have or assumes that there's a config server everywhere it goes, and then it suddenly finds itself in an environment where there isn't one, or even worse, um, you write your tests assuming there isn't a config server, and then you run the tests in an environment where there is one, and it suddenly behaves differently. And so I've seen some really bad outcomes of basically not controlling the environment that the code's running in. So I think profiles are the answer, right? Spring profiles, you can switch all that stuff off really quickly. Even just in a properties file, right? So you could just have a properties file that says, in the development profile, switch off config client because you want to control the fact that everything's local because you're testing. That's the kind of pattern that I would recommend. So profiles, development specific profiles, properties, local properties files that work out of the box are a good idea, I believe, so that you can always get something running. As for a developer, right, you want your dev team to be up to speed really quickly. If somebody comes and looks at your code and wants to try it out, they should be able to press the button and it just works. They don't have to, go through a 100-page process to set up the environment variables and configure the config server. And those those kinds of apps are always a nightmare to work with. The things that are nicely isolated, so each service has its own concerns and explicitly encodes that in the profiles that it works with, and you can see that in the code base. Those are the ones that are most successful. The really properly modular distributed systems, I guess that's the way to think about it. Do we have some more questions coming in? Looks like there's a
We
bit of
do,
a thirst
yeah.
of them.
Yeah, so let's try this one. So this is from Lewis. He says, I recently started with Webflux. I've created some reactive endpoints in the classic way using the REST controller, and I created some in the new way using the router function. What are the main differences in the request lifecycle? Oh, hello, Mrs. Dave.
That's Sarah. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Sarah, you are live.
Live to the nation there.
She says she hasn't done her hair. I don't suppose anybody noticed.
That was your BBC moment, hopefully, for today. Yeah, so Lewis's question about Webflux and
so Webflux, yeah, REST controller and router function. As far as I know, there are 0 differences in the life cycle. It's really just about kind of its metadata, essentially telling Spring how to set up the request handlers, right? So you get the same effect at the end of the day. There might be, yeah, pretty sure there is a slightly different code path when you're using annotations at runtime, because when every request comes in, we have to look at it, look at the path, look at the request parameters, look at the body sometimes of the request, and use that information to route the request to a handler, right? A method that contains business logic. So yeah, I'm just wondering. I think so it might be slightly more reflective is what I'm thinking if it's annotation driven, because it's all sort of metadata, right? So with your at get mapping, you're just saying, I want the route to be to this method, and the method has to therefore be called, it's not in an interface or anything, it has to be called reflectively. Whereas with router functions, it's all non-reflective, it's all imperative, right? There are some object creation overhead still in the router function code path. And most of the reflection, in fact, I think all of the reflection in Java reflection terms gets done in the annotation case, gets done at startup time, right? When the first request comes in, essentially. So when the mappings are made, if you're under heavy traffic, then you're not paying any extra cost for that. It's the only cost you're paying is a reflective method call, which is frankly nothing. So the code path might be different, but I don't think there's a lot of functional difference between the two approaches. So really, it's kind of, what do you like the best? I know Ian's giving a presentation later on this afternoon about functional style in Webflux and in MVC, actually. So that might be interesting if you want to follow up on that. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So we did a lot of work in that, by the way. Spring 5.2, Spring Boot 2.2. They looked at the runtime code paths for request processing and found a lot of inefficiencies, especially in the annotation code paths, but I think on both sides. So we've cleaned up a lot of things there. That was new, right, in Spring 5. So they took a couple of minor versions of Spring to sort of smooth things out and make them faster. But you see a lot of improved latency, for instance, at runtime with Spring 5.2 and Spring Boot 2.2, and that's the source of those improvements, is basically analyzing the request routing code paths. So we used to do a lot of, it wasn't reflection that was the problem, it was actually Java 8 programming model patterns like lambdas and optionals and things like that, and streams, or that those Java 8 APIs, Java 8 language features were being very heavily used in very hot code paths, and they sometimes lead to problems because of garbage collection pressure. So you've got a lot of tiny objects being created in very tight loops. Everything works, everything's fine, but it can be a little bit of a drag on performance just because of objects being created and then having to be destroyed. So the garbage collector has to sort of deal with it for you. So we changed a lot of those internal, you wouldn't have noticed it from the programming model, but we changed a lot of internal implementations of request handling, request mapping in Spring 5.2, and that was a big change in Spring Boot 2.2. But like I said, functionally, I think they're identical. They're slightly different code paths.
Yeah, and we've had another question come in, Dave, which is on a kind of a related topic. And I get this. It's not a frustration, but it's an observation, which is that when you start to make the move from imperative to more reactive like code, and you look around at code samples and that sort of stuff, you notice that, this is from Mr. Dutter, I think, you notice that reactive code blocks quite often end up with a dot block. Why how is this the future of code?
I suspect that's a mistake. Dot block is great for testing and for demos, but it's not great for production code. It kind of defeats the object, right? If you see that in your code, then you probably want to have a think about it.
Right.
It's hard. I mean, I'm not saying there's anything easy about it, but there are. I guess what we need is more. I don't know. More help with people getting up that learning curve, right? Because everybody starts here and they need to get there. And once you're there, you're Stefan Maldini and you're Simon Basley and you're fine. But if you're
I don't think I'll ever be that good.
No, I know. I'm really lucky because I get to ask Simon, and Stefan's left now, but I mean, I could still call him and he would answer my questions. So yeah, they're a great resource. Yeah, that's what everybody needs a Stefan Maldini in his life. If he's starting work on reactive programming, that's for sure.
Yeah, and look, I've got to hold my hands up here. I've got some code I'm working on right now. There is a dot block in there. it's hard to know what to do for the best. So here's my example, because maybe this will help the folks out there at home. So I'm waiting for a connection to an RSocket server. So I'm customizing my RSocket thingy. Can't remember what it's called. And I've got to connect, via a particular TCP address, and then what do I do? Because I sort of need to know that everything's functioning before I then get on with other work. So what should people be doing in those sort of circumstances? Help me, Dave. Help.
Sorry, what was the problem again? What should you do if?
The problem is, okay, I'll summarize. I'm a terrible coder. I've got a dot block waiting for my RSocket connection. Should I have that,
Right.
or should I not have that?
Case by case, right? I mean, definitely if you're writing, I don't, because I haven't seen your
No, no one
example,
looks at my
I
code.
can't
Don't
comment,
worry
but
about
if you were writing a REST controller with webflux and you had a dot block anywhere in that code, it would definitely be a mistake. It's probably the same with an RSocket listener, but I don't know what your exact use case is. If you're just waiting for a connection to an RSocket server, maybe that's okay, because you have to, you have to know that you're blocking, right? You have to recognize that you're going to block up a thread. If you're not in, if you call .block and you're not on a reactive thread, it's okay. That's what it's for. So you have to be aware of where you are when you call it, basically. Blockhound is
Okay,
really good. Blockhound is a
cool.
good tip for everyone, right? Go the blockhound.io, I think it is. This is Sergey's static analysis tool, so it'll basically, you can switch it on at runtime, or you can just switch it off and on as you please. It'll just barf if you start blocking on reactor threads, and that's a useful thing to do because it tells you where you've made a mistake. So
Right. So
I would
I'm
run. My advice is run your code through Blockhound. If you see exceptions, then you made a mistake. If you didn't, then you're probably all right. If
okay.
you do see exceptions in Blockhound, sometimes they're false signals as well. So it's worth just asking if you've seen one. But a good guidance is if you're on a reactor thread and you can tell from the logs, right, so you could just log something and see what the log line says, and if the log line's, the thread name is obviously from a reactor thread pool, then you've done it wrong. That's
Right.
a good rule of thumb.
Wow, there's some brilliant advice there. So use Blockhound. Maybe get a peer review from a friendly Springer.
Put some logging in, look at the thread names.
Put
Yeah.
some logging in. Right, cool. Okay. On a similar topic, we have another anonymous attendee, boo, asking a question. This particular person is interested in things like gRPC and RSocket, and their question is, given, if you were considering those two things, which is better suited for scenarios like streaming of events from multiple services? Any ideas on that, Dave?
Well, I think they'll both do a pretty good job. Our socket has back pressure built into it. gRPC, you've got to kind of simulate it. gRPC is only protobuf, so that might be an advantage or a disadvantage. But if you don't like protobufs, then our socket is just a bytes, transport bytes, so you can put anything in it. Those are the differences. um, yeah, our socket enables some very interesting sort of gateway patterns that I'm not sure I've seen with gRPC, like the stuff that Netlify are doing. I think Spencer had a talk about it. There's an RSocket gateway in Spring Cloud, I believe. So those features are sort of unique, I think. So that's the reason you do that is if you've got two things that need to communicate with each other, but they're never sure if they're going to be there or if the other one's going to be there, but you can just sort of act as as if the other one was always there, and you only talk to the gateway, and because of back pressure, the gateway will just tell you, sorry, not able to do that right now, but that is expected. That's an expected signal on the client. So that kind of pattern is where the back pressure comes in handy, and I don't think you can do that so easily with gRPC. gRPC is great. I mean, you can create some lovely tools with it, lovely systems with it. You can get it going pretty quickly. It's nicely polyglot, but our socket has a lot of the same features, I suppose, but more.
So you've always got choices, haven't you, Dave? And it's about sort of
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes. There are too many choices. Yeah, so it's nuanced, right? So nobody can tell you that one thing is right and the other is wrong, and you
Let's see
shouldn't
what
take it. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going.
I was just about to say, you shouldn't take the fact that Spring doesn't have support or integration with something as a bad reason to use it either. I mean, gRPC is a good example of that. You can use gRPC with Spring, and we don't provide anything because we don't really need to. You can just spin up a server in 2 lines of code. Why would I need Spring to help me with that? So yeah, I mean, just more nuances, I'm afraid. More different ways to make a decision.
I think that's entirely fair. So, folks, we're here on Spring Live. We're going to be with Dave for another, what, about 20 minutes or so, Dave, I think?
Is it? Yeah, that sounds about right, yeah.
So get your questions into the Q&A and we can put them to Dr. Dave live. In the meantime, while we're waiting for those to come in, I've got some more for you, Dave. So we have someone asking, as we do a flat map, this is a reactive method, isn't it? Flat mapping. We lose the traceability as it starts a new context in the webflux. Is there any recommendation for this? You come across that?
I mean, yeah, I know what it means, but I haven't had to solve that problem myself. I think they must have solved it in Spring Security, for instance, and in Spring Cloud Sleuth. So there's probably a pattern that you can reuse that I don't know about. I didn't work on any of that stuff, so I don't know for sure. Can we promise to get back to the people that we don't, adequately service? Because I did say, I can't answer all the questions, but I'd probably know somebody who can in this case.
No, that's absolutely fine. We have the Q&A will be running throughout the whole of today's live segment 3 through to 5 p.m. I think. So yeah, there's more than enough time. And later on, I think
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do actually, Ben. So I didn't have a presentation for this slot, but I can write the questions and the answers up into some slides, and you can post that right when you post the
yeah, perfect. Yeah,
the wash up links. Everybody will get a link to the question.
I like it. That sounds like a plan. Someone else is asking, it's Roman is asking, will we see Webflux support for Rabbit template in the near future, e.g. a reactive Rabbit template? I like the sound of the name right off the top.
Yeah, what would a reactive rabbit look like?
Don't ask that
Jumping
question.
all over the place.
I'm sure, yeah. It would be very responsive. Let's put it that way. So, yeah, what do you think?
I don't know. That's interesting. The Rabbit client is already non-blocking. I know that. So yeah, that's another one I'll have to get back to you on. If anybody knows the answer, then it'll be Artem or Gary, right? But I think, yeah. So why would you need it? I suppose is the question. Maybe to send a message. I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like it's a no-op, like because the Rabbit client is already non-blocking, so I don't know.
It's already
for sure.
async, so
I don't know. I don't know for sure. I know that the listeners are efficient with threads because the Rabbit client is non-blocking. I think we'd have to get Gary on the case to answer that question properly. He'd know, like, with no hesitation, he would tell you the answer straight away. I'm afraid I can't, but we can definitely ask, and we'll put it in the slides when we're finished.
Okay, sounds good. And then I've got another question here from Lewis. I think hopefully Lewis, I got your pronounce your name right. So it's related to the dot block question from earlier on.
Oh yeah.
Popular question. So
Right.
if you're needing to call two external APIs and wait for the first response to then trigger the second call, how do you wait using the web client? Is there an advantage of using web client over REST template in these kinds of scenarios?
Right. Well, yeah, I should think so. It's a very common pattern, right? So if we don't have a getting started guide for this, then we should. It should be in the sort of, use web client getting started guide. I'm not sure there is one, but I'll volunteer to write it. Yeah, so you just chain the, because they're non-blocking, right? You just do web client.get, and then with the response you do then, or something, whatever the reactive. It's then, I think. There's a thing that tells reactor to wait for the completion signal for the first request and then start the second one. And it's all non-blocking, right? So if you return from that method call and the result is a publisher, a Flux, or a Mono, no actual requests have been made yet to the remote system, right? So those requests only get made once the blocking, well, not the blocking, once the subscription comes in. And you probably aren't the one who's responsible for subscribing. That's the thing, that's the way you avoid block, right? So the way that you would avoid blocking, the way you avoid using the block method is to delegate the subscription to somebody else. And typically if you're in a web app, then that's going to be Webflux that's going to do the subscription for you. So you're in a controller method. This method signature returns publisher or Flux, and that thing that you return isn't the result of the computation at all, right? It's just a plan about how to carry out the computation when it's needed. So you can build in that plan. Build into that plan, you can say, do this call, and when that finishes, do that one. But don't wait for the result. Go off and do something else while you're busy. So that's what Reactor is, basically. That's just the whole reason for it to exist is that it has those big APIs like Flux with all those convenience methods, and it is a bit bewildering. So finding the right one can be a problem, but there is one. There's a whole class of them. I think they're called then, but it's the wait for the completion signal and then do something else, that pattern. But
Right,
don't
so
block
you're
in between.
basically chaining these things together. You're chaining these groups of instructions together, essentially. But you're
Yes.
delegating that off to the Webflux environment to handle that for you at the right time.
Yes, the subscriber has to subscribe to the Flux that you've returned, and then carry out the steps that are encoded in the operators inside it, and it has to follow those instructions. And if one of the instructions says wait for a completion signal, and then do this, then it'll go away and do something else while it's waiting for the requester, for the first API request to finish. And that's, smart people write those subscribers, not me. So I never want to write a subscriber to a Flux. I want that to happen inside frameworks like Spring Web Flux, like Spring RSocket.
Yeah, and it'll keep your code cleaner as well, right? Because you're
Yeah,
delegating.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, if you get yourself into the sort of mental habit of thinking, I'm not writing code that's going to execute, I'm writing a plan for somebody else to execute it. So that makes me think about it differently anyway. That sort of helps me to sort of get my head around what I'm trying to do sometimes with fluxes and monos.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a new form of separation of concerns. Basically, you can delegate those things off and let the framework handle those things at the right time. But there is a way for you to get quite complex. You can chain things together. You can do what you need to do inside that Webflux API, right?
Yeah, it's really, I think it's the Reactor API, but yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
correct. Sorry, my bad. Yes, the Reactor API. Gotcha. Okay. So we have another question. When working, this is from Baz. Thank you, Baz. When working with microservice architecture where multiple databases get spinned up inside one host, are you with me so far?
Spun up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was the one host thing I was thinking about.
Okay, right.
It sounded interesting in a microservice architecture, multiple databases.
Yeah, I wouldn't make any assumptions about the host, but anyway, yeah, carry on.
Okay, okay. How would you go about connecting these, and how would you go about transactions on something that's been committed inside another microservices? Does Spring have anything to help with this?
Well,
But this question, architecturally speaking, as an architect, this is probably one that we'd start whiteboarding, isn't it? We'd want to have more information about what's meant by a host, what these databases are, what they do, what the
yeah.
microservices are, how they're related to each other. Are they within the same domain? Are they different domains? There's a lot of
Yeah, there are
imaginary
lots of
sort of
questions. More
paradoxes.
questions than answers. Is the
Yeah, sorry,
okay,
Baz.
it's what you're saying. I agree. Yeah, more questions than answers. I mean, one of the it's not a 12-factor rule, but I think there are people are talking about 8 factors now, aren't they? One of the new style rules of thumb for microservices is that they should only have one database, and then you don't have to deal with multiple. That sometimes you can't avoid it. There's some legacy situation where you've got data in 2 places that you need to maintain, but if you also need that to be transactionally consistent, then I think you're in trouble, right? That
Yeah.
that isn't a good place to be. So you'll end up with distributed transactions. JTA is still an option. It's still there, and Spring supports it, but nobody would recommend that that's your first choice, right? Everybody would try and avoid that to start with, and then what it comes down to really is business logic. So you have to think of it in terms of, if something goes wrong, who can I tell so that they can fix it? So it's all about having detailed enough information about what you were trying to do and why it didn't work, and then who to send that information to, and then it has to be automatically, if possible, remediated that way, right? So there are patterns here, right? If you read Chris Richardson's stuff, for instance, Chris actually even has a Java framework, or I think it's Java, JVM framework, at least anyway,
Yeah,
called Eventuate.
eventuate. Yeah.
Eventuate, yeah, it's really interesting, which has a lot of these patterns encoded in it. Sagas, I think, is the pattern that the name that he gives the pattern for, you know, compensating transactions, basically. So everything has standard uni resource transaction semantics, but they talk to each other in such a way that they can correct each other's mistakes. That's the best way to think about it. And it is more complicated. You don't just switch it on and go, everybody's transactional, everybody's happy, we're all golden. You do actually have to build the logic into your system.
Yeah, we're
What's a
basically
mistake?
talking about a move to more event-driven architecture, essentially, aren't we? With
Events
this,
help, yeah, because events are sort of the thing that encodes the details that I was talking about, right? What did I do? What went wrong? How can you help? Those kinds of questions, which you just don't get from a database insert that failed, right? You don't have any information about, what the business context was. So the business context is important. And so the transaction fails, maybe you have to actually notify the user who's impacted by it. You have to send them an email and say, oh, I'm sorry, we screwed up. We're sorting it out, but in the meantime, your statement was wrong or something, right? That's kind of an extreme example, but it's all about message passing and about the detail of the domain knowledge that's encoded in the messages that you're sending.
Yeah, so sorry, Baz, bit of a tricky one that because
It
there's
is
a
tricky, yeah, but I would encourage you to look at Eventuate and Chris Richardson's book and his website. It's called microservices.org, right? That's the one. I'll just check that exists.
yeah, I don't recall. Okay, so yeah, check that out. Dave, we have
Okay,
a
that's
few
not
minutes
microservices.
left.
Oh, yeah, okay. Do we have any
I do
juicy
have one.
ones?
I do have one more.
Microservices.io, I just found it.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, we have one more from Zardub. Hopefully, I've said that correctly. Apologies if I haven't. You mentioned Spring Cloud earlier. It's mainly aimed at managing properties per environment. Is it a good pattern to also manage multi-tenant configuration using Spring Cloud Config? Come across anyone using multi-tenant and Spring Cloud Config, Dave?
I'm not sure. I mean, some of the questions, support questions we get, sound like people might be trying to do it. So it's quite complex, actually, the rules for how the so you ask the config server for a set of properties. You can just give it. You only give it 3 pieces of information. You say basically the app name, the profile, and a label, which could be a Git label or like master or a commit ID or something like that, depending on the back end. So those are the 3 degrees of freedom. So we have been asked a few times whether we could support more degrees of freedom, and often what it comes down to is you can use those 3, but it's about the way that you structure the data in the back end. So for instance, if you wanted an additional degree, which was tenant ID or something, could you do that? That's the kind of question that we get. I mean, not specifically that, but I've seen that pattern kind of investigated. And I think the conclusion we came to was that 3 was probably good enough to get something working. So like if you were to try it and really struggled, then maybe there would be a good case for, extending the feature set. We have talked about it from time to time, but my impression is you could get something working with the existing backends. It depends on the way that you structure the data in the backend. So you can have different Git servers, different directory layouts. You could I can't remember how it works with the database source, but you can structure the data in the back end in lots of different ways, and I think that would probably get where you need to go, but I can't be confident until we sort of go through the exercise on a whiteboard or a a prototype or something.
Yeah, maybe I was going to say maybe
yeah.
if the Spring folks, Spring Cloud folks are around later, maybe they could also talk to that question.
You could ask again later, yeah. I mean, we were supposed to be having our face-to-face Spring Cloud planning face-to-face meeting in Warsaw next week, and that's sort of been called off because of because of this bug. So that question about config server comes up every time we have a planning meeting. So it's not like something we haven't talked about. It's just one that we haven't prioritized yet because we think that most people can do most of their use cases already, and we haven't had any strong examples of patterns that were extremely painful that we could help with. So I don't know, watch this space, it might happen, especially if you're interested and motivated in specking out what it is that you need. And I think it'd be much more likely that something would happen, but we don't want to
That's it.
overcomplicate anything.
No, get in touch, Sadab. If you're there, you have these use cases. You can, elaborate on what sort of things you'd like to see. Then, get in touch with the folks in Spring Cloud Config and see, see if there's something that can be done there. Because I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. Dave, I think that brings us almost to the end of our time, my friend.
Oh, that's sad.
Said with limited emotion.
No, that's just me. That's, you know me. I'm very
Okay,
sad.
hopefully
I could
this
talk
hasn't
all
been,
day.
yeah, hopefully this hasn't been too torturous for you.
No, it's
Thank you.
great. No, thank you very much for helping out, Ben. You've been very, yes,
Hey,
useful.
it's my pleasure. But no, thank you to you from everybody here for answering these questions, which you didn't know what they were going to be. I didn't know what they were going to be.
There
So
might not have even been any if we were really unlucky.
yeah, so considering
We
the,
might have just been chatting to ourselves for an hour. You never know. And
I
luckily that didn't happen.
I think considering the creativity of the Spring community to make mischief, I think we got away with it not pretty well. So thank you to everyone who's been watching. You join us here on Spring Live.